Hello, listeners. Welcome back to another episode of Cognitive Dissidents. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me on the podcast today is Dan Basse. Dan is the president of Ag Resource. I've gotten to know Dan over the course of this year. I spoke at his one of his events in Geneva, Switzerland, earlier this year, and Dan was actually with me in Dublin. I guess, was that a couple weeks ago, a month ago now? So anyway, we were both speaking to an audience of dairy farmers and producers here in Wisconsin. We'll be doing it again to a larger audience in March. So we made some time after we both spoke to set aside and talk about, really just to talk shop a little bit about the world, markets in general, and Dan's perspective on things. We're recording this on Tuesday, November the 29th at about 2 p.m. In the afternoon. This will come out probably in a couple days, and if you hear this on one of Dan's channels, hello, I'm Jacob, and it's nice to meet you. Otherwise, not a whole lot more for me. Exciting to be able to do some of these podcasts now out on the road and in person with people that I'm interacting with on some of my travels. Get ready for a lot more of this type of content going forward. I even checked a bag so that I could bring the nice mic so you could hear it in high def. So I hope you appreciate that as well. So enough rambling from me. Cheers. See you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. So I'm joined by Dan Basse. We are we just both spoke at the Dairies Professional Development Organization conference here in Madison, Wisconsin. Dan, I usually joke that I like to have the feel that this podcast is, two people having a beer, but the microphones happen to be on. I actually get to be in person with you. It's a rare joy for me. So thanks for making some time before you have to go back to Chicago.
You can bring the beer if you want, Jacob. I'm quite fine with that, even at the middle of the day, but we'll have good fun.
Well, I can try and go see if they'll bring us some spotted cows right now. I've been having a good time with the spotted cow. So I'm here to talk about geopolitics, and you're here to talk about markets. I thought we might just start, we didn't share each other's slides with each other beforehand, and we both, I feel like one of the fulcrum slides in both of our presentations was that U.S. dairy output slide in general. It was really surprising to me because a lot of times when I'm doing these sorts of events, I'm thinking in terms of telling these audiences that they need to think about exports in different countries, and maybe you shouldn't be thinking about China so much. But the dairy industry, they're not that exposed to China, at least not relative to some other grains. And also they have a captive market here in the United States. It feels to me like local is the answer for them.
No, it really is, Jacob. And when you think about America, I mean, we've all lost our desire to drink fluid milk, or let's say it's been replaced by almond, soy, hemp, and lots of others in the milk case. But what we really have been clamoring on is product. And so when you look at consumption of yogurt, when you look at the consumption of cheese and butter, we are now reaching highs. And if I go back, and think about the 1970s and 80s, everybody had this idea that fat was bad, that it was going to cause cardiac arrest and you were going to die as an old man, overweight at the age of 50. And now we know from recent studies that we really need some dairy fat or some fat, and that it's good for neurological, and I don't want to say it's a health benefit, but it still is it's something that is good for our diet.
Yeah, although maybe that was peak fat, and now we're going away from peak fat. Peak oil was a refrain that I think came through the presentation in general. To your point, U.S. per capita consumption of cheese apparently has doubled since 1979. I guess that's a bunch of keto diets out there or something like that. I'm not sure.
Cheese has doubled, and if you think back, I mean, we used to consume a tremendous amount of trans fat and margarine. People would drive across state lines to get margarine because they thought it was healthy and beneficial. Now we know that those trans fats from hydrogenation of vegetable oils is absolutely almost a death sentence. And so, thinking back to the 70s, 80s, and even 90s, how wrong the information was scientifically from the food industry and where we sit today.
Yeah, I wonder how wrong it will will be 20 years from now, we're probably putting something in our bodies that is terrible.
It could be, but I always have this thesis that Mother Nature may know best. And so, I'm not saying that dairy or milk is God's perfect food unless you're a calf. But I think it's probably better than what some of the manufactured products are out there today.
Yeah. Well, when we take a step back, so we're here trying to educate the dairy industry about, market risks and geopolitical risks to things that are going on. Where do you, because you and I have only been sort of interacting for the last year and a half or so. What was the moment that you feel like geopolitics and agricultural markets really started like waking up to the existence of the other? Because I've been doing this for a long time, and we get the occasional agricultural client, but we were kept at arm's distance quite a lot. But now it seems like geopolitical analysis is becoming a big deal in the agricultural space. I was just wondering when that switch flipped for you.
Well, it was really for me, and I think it all goes back to globalization. But I remember early in my career, so I started in this business in 1979, and back then there was a guy named Jimmy Carter, and I remember in I believe it to be January, he decided to, of course, put an embargo against Russia. Russia at that point was fighting Afghanistan, and to our chagrin, we weren't happy with that, and so we put an embargo against Russia, which sent U.S. food prices and grain prices through the floor. We were limit down multiple days in Chicago markets. Finally, through the leadership of a gentleman named Robert Kohlmeyer, a guy from, at that point was the vice president of Cargill, the U.S. government came in and bought all the Russian contracts for grain. Now, Russia, if you remember, was a food exporter, but they had something called a collective farm system, which started to fail badly back in the early 1970s. And that combination of a failure of the collective farm system and a little disease called southern corn blight really caused a amplification of inflation and food prices in the 1970s, which then got us into the 80s. In that war, Russia and Afghanistan then precipitated the embargo, and that's when geopolitics really became a big deal, as the world's largest importer was battered by the world's largest exporter, the United States, and food prices globally had a big transition after that.
What similarities do you see between now and the early 1970s, or differences? Because we are sort of in food crisis land, and Russia is again sort of a big question mark. So are there more similarities than differences, or more differences than similarities?
Well, there's similarities and differences. I think back to the 70s, and we have the same shortage of supply that we did in the 1970s. Inflation is, you and I as economists or geopolitical analysts, we think about definition of inflation, which is more dollars chasing fewer goods. The more dollars are now coming out. The Fed is doing its job to kind of pull back on that. If you look at M2, it has just collapsed, but we still don't have enough goods or supplies out there. So if you really want to get inflation under control, we need more corn, more soybeans, more wheat, which are the three pillars of the food chain. And then we need the availability of energy and other things to get it to market. And then we'll start to see inflation reaction. Today, what the government is trying to do is destroy demand, which can temporarily bring down inflation, but it's not going to solve it because we're still not doing what the market needs, which is bringing more acres into production.
Yeah, I think that was one of the only, you and I think broadly agreed on almost everything in both of our presentations. They played off each other in terms of, coming at the same topic from different angles. But one place I didn't find myself disagreeing, but that I was thinking of the counterfactual, which was the idea that we're headed towards a sort of stagflation-y era. Because it seems to me, even though everything you just said about supply side being the issue, you think the Fed is also going to continue to hammer interest rates up and up and up until it can get inflation down to 2%, if that's even possible within the current supply side system. So I would think that eventually the Fed is going to have to admit defeat, just like they eventually admitted defeat on the transitory conversation. For me, the question is when, but it sounds like you're less sanguine that the Fed is actually going to pivot, because you were talking about, interest rates 5, 6, even 7% for the better part of the decade. So help me square kind of the supply side issues and why you think the Fed is going to stick to interest rates that high for the rest of the decade.
Well, if we go back to the 1970s, and at that point we had a guy named Arthur Burns who'd made a pivot too early and gave us a big spike of inflation later that decade. It takes a long time to get that inflation genie back in the bottle. It's not something that happens, particularly when we have supply shortages. So the world now is consuming more grain, that three pillars of the food chain, than we have production. And we need to bring more acreage into production. We think somewhere around 24 million acres, principally from South America. That does not mean that prices are high today and then drop, because if they drop, that land doesn't come into production, we end up with that same shortage. So this is the proverbial beach ball, pushing it underneath the water through what the Fed is trying to do with higher rates. When they slow down or pause, that beach ball comes back, and then they got to fight again. This is why, as I think about interest rates for the next decade and longer, I think we're going back to normality, like we had rates in the 80s and 90s. I'm not talking about the early 80s when we had rates at 18 to 21% of the Volcker years, but I am thinking about rates being more in the Fed funds, let's say 3 to 7% over an extended period of time, if indeed we want to keep our foot on what I believe is the big issue: not having enough energy, not having enough food, not having enough raw material, stuff you can hold in your hand and drop on your foot.
Mm-hmm. Am I right then to say that you're fairly bullish then across the board when it comes to agricultural commodities?
I would say that we're, if you were to ask us for the last 2 years, we've been relatively bullish. As the money, which investment funds do wonders, if you will, in the commodities world, because hedge funds just kind of overwhelm commodities. Their billions is something we can't handle. But today, because of rising rates in that new asset class called cash, the hedge fund money's not coming in. So I would imagine that until we hit the pause button, that you're going to see many banks, hedge funds and others staying away from commodities, which will give us the ability to retreat at least maybe for another 12 or 18 months. And then as everybody calms down and we think the world is in order, that's when commodities will start raging back. So I don't see this as a one and done in terms of a bull market in commodities. We think this is a longer term structural market that will have episodes of bullishness that cause the world central banks to have headaches.
Yeah, it's striking what you say, because if you look at a chart of sort of grain production or grain yields going back hundreds of years, like the one thing that we seem to have been able to do as a species continually is to drive down the price of producing grains and to increase efficiency and increase yields. And one of the things you said to me that really stood out today was you noted that around 2016, at least in the United States, or I think, was it global or in the United States?
It was global.
It was global. Where the yields were sort of flatlining, that maybe we're going for a lower yield sort of scenario going forward. That seems like an unprecedented change in the lifetime of most people who are probably listening to this podcast.
Oh yeah, it's a big deal. Jacob, if you think about it, farmers always do what farmers do best at, which is producing more at a lower cost. It's been going on for millennia, as you say. About 5-6 years ago, we started to see global grain yields stagnating, and we were mystified as to why that was happening. What's going on here? Because we believe that farmers continue to push the envelope in terms of yield and always want to produce more supply. And that's just not happening on a per capita basis. So as we sit today, if I don't have additional supply, I even need more acres. And this gets down to the job of the market. Now, somewhere between 2050 and 2060, the world will reach peak farmland. We think we've reached peak farmland in the United States, but when that happens and there's no more arable acres, the yield question, if you will, becomes all important, because at that point, technology needs to expand production to feed an ever-growing world. If it's not there, then humankind has a real difficulty.
Help me with this idea of peak farm. Well, first of all, I think one of the most compelling things I've heard you talk about is this idea of peak farmland. So why don't you just let me tee you up tell the listeners what peak farmland is, and then I want to pick at a question or two.
Yeah, no problem. So in the United States, in terms of arable farmland, which is crop acres that have enough rainfall and blessed with enough topsoil to produce crops, it's somewhere in the vicinity of 267 million acres, excluding hay. Now, hay is something that animals eat, principally cows and horses. We don't have multi-stomach stomachs, so it doesn't do us much good. That being said, we do need so many hay acres, and then there's this amount of land that's held by the government called conservation reserve acreage. Today, there's about 23 million acres in this program. This was established in 1987, such that farmers would keep fragile farmlands for wildlife and for waterfowl, and other things. And that this was, whether it's a flyway or something else, that the government would pay farmers to keep this in a landmass that was tucked away for a decade. Today, we're left with that same 23 million acres. Now, it used to be up around 39, but it's stable. But the USDA at one point was bidding $40 to $50 an acre for this fragile land. Now we're up over 300. So this land that's there that now has saplings on it and other things is not coming back into production. We've taken hay acres down to its lowest level since 1903. And so I can't take acres down anymore because ultimately cattle and horses still have to eat. And so I've now got about 270 million acres, around numbers, and there's no more making farmland. We're using every acre that's out there. And so for the United States in our history, we've never been in this spot of using every acre and not having the ability when prices are high and needing more supply to reach back and say, okay, I'm going to farm this land or that land, bring it under plow and have it available to the U.S. and world consumer.
Yeah, so my question there is, it seems to me that, one of the reasons that people have left the farming profession, it's really a lifestyle, is that it's really hard for the point that we just talked about. You can produce more and more and more, but the better you are at farming, the lower prices that are actually going to be in the marketplace, right? Because if you produce more, that means there's more on the market. And so there's this sort of negative incentive structure for farming that is different than almost any other commodity that is produced in the world. And I'm bringing that up to say that it seems to me that's one of the reasons that people have left farming in general. When I fly from New Orleans to Madison, Wisconsin, or I fly to Great Falls at the end of this week, I see lots of empty land. When I think about, the small town that I grew up in Georgia and the small farm that we had, there's plenty of land around us that if you put in a modicum of effort, you could probably turn into arable land. So how do I square there's this many acres and we've reached peak farmland, but it seems like, when you fly over the United States, it seems like there's so much land. It's not like when I fly over the European continent, I see a village every other section and the land is spoken for. It doesn't look like the land is spoken for. It doesn't look like peak farmland. So what am I missing there?
Well, I think what you're missing is that the topsoils, the availability of what I call fertile production soil is not there. There may be a lot of land out there that has trees or pasture or something that's out there, but it's not something as a farmer we would ever consider planting because the yield on that acreage would be so low. I always say we probably know more about 200 miles above our head on the moon or in space than what we know about 2 feet below our feet. Soil science and the amount of research we need to understand topsoils, the microorganisms, the fertilization cycles, all of that needs to be conducted more actively. And farmers are very good at understanding soil types and where they can make money. And there's a lot of land out there that they just can't farm because there's not enough money in it unless prices go 3 times higher than where they are today.
Or unless fertilizer prices go 3 times lower than where they are today.
Even as China, you can throw lots of fertilizer at land, but at the end of the day, the benefits or the cost on that is just not there. So think of a state like, let's say, Nebraska, which the western side of the state just doesn't get enough rainfall. The soil profile may be there, but unless you have an irrigation rig on it and availability of water, that farmland can't come back under plow. Or to your point on Georgia, there's some fragile and let's say less than desirable farmland there that may come back if corn was priced at $12 a bushel versus $6. But today at $6, there's no chance it's going to come into production. And we as consumers, we don't want $12 corn because all of a sudden our 6.67% of disposable income doubles and we're all going to have to decide what we're going to do less of because we're spending more on food.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that was another one of the most striking things that you said in your presentation, which was you had a chart of how much disposable income different countries put towards food. And the United States was 6.7%, so on the fairly low end of the chart. But then you look at places like India, Nigeria, some other countries where it can be up to even Turkey, which is a country I've been bullish on in sort of recent months on this podcast, something like 60-70% of disposable income. So I don't know, I took your corrective to the audience on maybe not complaining so much about paying a couple extra dollars in the grocery store. But I don't know, that's what we do as Americans. We complain, right?
No, everybody likes to complain. It's, and when our food budgets go up 20%, we don't feel good and we may have to cut something else out in the budget. But generally speaking, we have the most abundant, cheapest food supply in the world in America, so we should be blessed by that.
Yeah. If we look kind of ahead, I've only just begun sort of starting to think about, putting last year in the rearview mirror and thinking about what's going to happen next year. I don't know if you feel this way. I feel at least the first half of this year, I felt like one of the worst geopolitical analysts in the world. Didn't get the Russia-Ukraine war right, didn't get Ukraine's resistance right, and sort of all the dominoes that fell from there. I feel like I'm starting to get back on my footing, but I'm trying not to make the same mistakes when I project into the year ahead. The Russia-Ukraine war is also still looming. I feel like when we're talking about wheat and corn, even sunflower, a lot's going to depend on what's happening in Ukraine and whether Ukrainian farmers can plant. Are we talking about Russia kind of coming apart at the seams? That's a rambling way of just sort of asking, what for you are sort of the biggest questions that you're looking at to think about 2023 as we get into that and start trying to make projections on that 12-month horizon?
Well, I think the two questions that come to my mind, Jacob, is number one, does the war against Ukraine end by, let's say, April of next year? Ukrainian farmers planted only half of a wheat crop. Some would say 60% of a wheat crop, though we don't have official data. So, wheat is not a commodity that's going to come out of Ukraine in abundance in the year ahead. If the war is over with by April, those farmers that didn't plant wheat can plant corn or sunflowers or another crop. And they will do that, and you'll see them, of course, rise to the challenge. I tell everybody that Ukrainian farmland is some of the best in the world, where it squeezes between your toes. It's sometimes that topsoil goes down 70 feet. And so fertilizer is something that you use sparingly in Ukraine because their soils are so good. It's the breadbasket of Europe. Historically, it has fed Europe. And so should the war be over with, I have all the confidence that Ukrainian farmers will come back and do what they need to do and produce more crop. That said, the other question is, I don't think the world can allow Russian President Putin to remain as a president of Russia without sanctions. And so if the war ends, what does it politically look like at Russia? You may have a view on that, but if everything breaks apart and the fabric of the current administration is broken to a degree that normalization of trade does not occur, Russia's the world's largest wheat exporter. So that would be a big deal in terms of Novolinsk and what the Russians do in terms of wheat trade and grain trade. So you may have some views on that, but those are the two things that would keep me up at night in terms of the Black Sea.
I mean, the Russians had a record wheat crop this year, right? Is that
almost 100 million metric tons privately, which their prior record was about 86. So a huge gimme from God in terms of wheat.
Well, yeah, although it was very difficult. It still is very difficult for Russian wheat. It seems to make it to most markets right now because some countries don't want to be buying wheat from Russia. There's still concerns over the Black Sea. I guess for me, the question that I'm considering is if Ukraine continues to kick Russian butt in the war and pushes them back, maybe Ukrainian farmers do get to plant, maybe Russian farmers don't get to plant, or maybe Russia's political volatility, or even, let's say, Putin stays in power and we do get these kind of increased sanctions and an increased global call to push back against Russia. I mean, you probably saw the Xi Jinping-Biden meetings a couple of weeks ago in Bali. Pretty striking that China seems to, I wouldn't say turn its back on Russia, but certainly taking a more cautious view towards Russia and seeming to reach out to the West a little bit. I mean, maybe Russia's in danger of losing the one friend that it sort of had left. So I don't know if you have a view on that, but I guess when I'm thinking about it from the course of next year, there's so much uncertainty, which is going to translate into volatility. And in some ways, I'm more worried about the Russian farmers than I am the Ukrainian farmers, which I can't even imagine having said that even a couple months ago in Geneva when we were talking at Grain World.
I think you're right, Jacob. I mean, if you were me to rank the two, I would put Russian production and farming above Ukrainian, because we just don't know what the end game of this looks like. And I may be wrong, but I'm kind of betting that the war will be over with by April or May. And again, forecasting, as you do all the time, is very difficult. But it seems to me that the Russians just don't have technology right. I mean, when you can fly a drone over a Russian troop and drop an artillery from 70 miles away within a square meter, the Russians were not expecting that. And so that has been their demise. And I believe that continues. The problem for the Ukraine is the appetite of Europe and the United States to keep funding the billions that are going there right now with the new House coming into play in January and what that all means for Ukrainian military equipment and their future. But I whether there's a resolution or whether there's something that is more adverse than that, I think the main thing the world can't do is allow Putin to escape and be in a position of power even after this war without some payback, if you will, for society and bandwidth for Ukraine and Europe.
I don't know. Yeah, one of our recent guests, Jacek Bartoszak, he's a Polish geopolitical strategist, and he was on our podcast a couple weeks ago, really, really down about European support for the Ukrainians going forward and for Poland in general. And I'm pretty bullish on the European Union. I think this is a big moment for the European Union, but I was almost taken aback by how negative Jacek was on the situation, because he was basically saying the Germans are two-faced. They're saying one thing, but they're doing another thing, and they're going to pressure Ukraine to end this war as quickly as possible. The flip side is that's not what the Ukrainians are saying. I mean, Zelensky wants to push on and wants to take Crimea and take everything back. That was Ukraine's. So we have more uncertainty than answers there.
I don't know who's right in this whole thing, but I think the Ukrainians understand the urgency to push this ahead, and they will keep doing that through the winter. And so we'll see what happens. But decisively within Russia, I think the public is turning against Putin to some degree. And their silencing of social media and other things is worrisome, but this is not the way a country becomes dominant or moves in a direction that's going to be victorious. And so I think we're both right in saying that the Russians have tremendous issues going forward. I just don't know. I don't think anybody understands what the end game really looks like in this war.
Yeah, and the one cautionary tale. So I referenced one of the things I keep saying in talks like these, like the one we just gave to the dairy producers, is think of the world as multipolar and think of the 1890s as a nice historical analog for what's going on. And I always call out, the 1890s, Russia picked a fight with a neighbor, in this case Japan, that it thought was going to be a cakewalk, and Japan ended up just really defeating Russia and rushing back on its heels. In some ways, the Russian Revolution and the rise of communism, you can maybe trace back to that decision. But that war was in the mid-1890s. It took until 1916, 1917, and the pressures of World War I to see that Russian regime collapse. So I think that, I don't know, I think Russian regimes are maybe more resilient than we give them credit for, because something that would be, to you and me, anathema or completely, make us rise up in arms, it maybe doesn't produce the same sort of thing in Russia. The other thing we've seen with Russia is that people who really disagree with Putin or who didn't want to get drafted into the Russian military as conscripts to be fodder in the war, they've all left. That's why Kazakhstan and Finland and all these countries, you're seeing these very large migration quotas. So it might just be that the people that are left in Russia either support the Putin regime or don't feel like they can care very much. If we move away from the Russia-Ukraine war, I thought the last topic we could just hit is we're both fairly optimistic about South America for very different reasons. And it sounds to me like you think South America and Brazil in general is kind of the hero of 2023 from kind of a global food market perspective thing? Is that pushing too far?
No, it's going to have to be the hero not only for 2023, but for probably the next 2 decades. Brazil still has an estimated 28 million acres to be brought into production inside the Cerrados, which doesn't include the rainforest. They're one of the only countries, along with maybe some in the Black Sea, that has this availability of farmland. So for that, there's a feather in their hat. The Brazilians also are blessed, agronomically speaking, with bad government. And so when you have bad government, your currency falls. Remember that all commodities are traded in dollar terms. So if you're pricing soybeans in reals, boy, it's a good day to be a Brazilian farmer. And land prices and their ability to expand have been rather remarkable for the last 10 years. I think that continues. I think Brazilian politics remains a mess, even though rates are coming down and are trying to get inflation under control. But I do see Brazil as being the next hub of world agricultural growth. And I think China is proving that, because just within the last 2 weeks, China has approved the import of Brazilian corn. Their corn suppliers heretofore was Ukraine and United States. They lost Ukraine and they quickly pivoted to Brazil. And I expect them to now be the biggest importer of Brazilian corn for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, that's bad news for U.S. exporters of corn who have enjoyed bumper Chinese imports.
Tremendously. And so, and what's remarkable about Brazil, this is kind of a little history in agriculture, is back in 2012, Brazil was a very small world exporter of corn. We had something in the United States called a Midwest drought that year. Got very dry and our yields went down. Corn prices moved up to $8 a bushel, which all of a sudden the Brazilian farmer, which had only planted soybeans, said, hey, I'm going to plant soybeans, but I'm going to follow and plant a second crop because there's margin called corn. And the Portuguese word for it is safrinha, which means little. And that little corn crop, safrinha crop, now has become a big, big corn crop. And Brazil, within the next couple of years, will become the world's largest corn exporter, all within a matter of 10 or 12 years.
I find myself on an island in the sense of I'm one of the only geopolitical analysts I know, in the English language at least, who is very, very bullish on Brazil. And I've been bullish on Brazil for a couple years now. But there's a lot of sort of doubt about Brazil geopolitically. I've read it, from sort of their geography is terrible. They can't connect it with infrastructure. It costs too much. I've even heard people say, the soil's terrible. They need all this fertilizer. None of this is sustainable. Right down to the politics, where people look at Bolsonaro and Lula and think the politics are absolutely terrible. I would tell you just to look at politics in the rest of the continent,
yeah, I was relative to the rest. It seems a little bit like home, but anyway, you could go from there.
Yeah, but I wanted to ask why you think people are underestimating Brazil. I mean, Brazil has not its track record doesn't necessarily say that it's ready to kind of ascend to global power status, but past performance is not indicative of sort of future behavior. So I wonder why you think people are so pessimistic about Brazil, or if you have an explanation for that.
I think a lot of us remember, we look at countries in South America like Argentina. Where Argentina is blessed with all of the resources God could give anyone. They've got fracking, they've got agricultural land, they've got beauty, they've got it all. Yet they've got just a government that makes a mess of policy, and they've got 50% of the country is in some form of poverty. And so even though when you have God's blessings, politicians can still make a mess of it. And we think then about the same for neighbors going up to the equator. And so Brazil falls into that category. But again, I go back and I look at what Brazil has done within the last 20 to 30 years. It has been absolutely remarkable that Brazil started agriculturally because of a Nixon problem with trade and banning of soybean exports to Japan back in 1973. The Japanese pivoted and said, hey, there's this country called Brazil we can source beans from. And then within a matter of roughly 30 years, Brazil's become the world's largest soybean exporter. Brazil has built out its infrastructure to export soybeans far beyond the United States. It's cheaper. The only thing they're lacking within Brazil is what I would say a Mississippi River. They have the Paraná River, but it's not the same degree. And they've got all these truckers, and every once in a while the truckers get mad because of high fuel prices. They go on strike, but the truckers still work for Brazil because there's so many of them that the competitive nature of their business makes it cheap to get grain from the interior to the export. So again, Brazil agriculturally, maybe not politically, has been just a giant in the world for the past 2 decades.
Mm-hmm. Before I let you go, because I know you got to hit the road, I've been thinking a lot about Mexico recently, and Mexico didn't come up for either one of us, actually, specifically. I think I mentioned it once in passing in terms of countries that are actually seeing trade as a percentage of GDP increase since 2008. Mexico is one of the only countries that's so. And for the audience that was in there that listened to us, I mean, Mexico is the biggest market for U.S. dairy exports. How do you think about Mexican agriculture right now? Are there opportunities there for the U.S.? Is that a competitor for the U.S. kind of in the long term? I haven't asked you, so I'm curious.
No, the Mexicans have been a good export market. There's some issues circulating right now that we've been U.S. prices into Mexico for agricultural commodities are too low. You've got the government right now in the presidency looking at banning GM products into Mexico, and this is going to happen in 2024. Secretary Vilsack met with the president yesterday. I don't think they made much progress. So there's some protectionism going on between the two countries. But at the end of the day, Mexico needs U.S. wheat. It needs U.S. corn, soybean meal. I think those trades continue, but it's not going to be a big growth engine for American agriculture. If there is any growth there, it'll be for things like U.S. pork or poultry. We think that'll happen, or dairy. It'll be a species item as opposed to just grains. But remembering that Mexico is now doing things like taking Russian wheat. They're diversifying. They understand that having one supplier may not be the best for them. And so it is changing the deck chairs a little bit, but I'm generally bullish of Mexico for American agriculture, just from proximity. But at the same standpoint, the Mexicans are wise enough to diversify to other sources around the world.
What about the Mexican agricultural sector itself? Has it underperformed? Has it overperformed?
It's underperformed for years, and all of that is due to their high cost. When you live in altitudes or poor soils, you need to have higher fertilization rates. That works against them. And when you've got goods flowing in from across the United States, the Mexicans are good at producing crops, which may be a vegetable like tomatoes. But when it comes to grain crops or livestock, we do much better than them. So labor-intensive crops, they perform well, and they may supplant California to a larger degree. But I don't think the major row crops is something that the Mexicans are looking at favoring going forward.
That all sounds great. Where to next? What's up for the rest of the year for you before?
Oh my God! So I've got the American Seed Trade Association, which is the big seed meeting of world genetics and seed trade in Chicago. We've got a big dairy meeting, a second one in Las Vegas. I'm doing a family trip to Morocco for the holidays. And then things kick off to big action. I become chairman of Farm Foundation next year. Farm Foundation is a group of people that helps delineate and accelerate agricultural practices practices for the benefit of farmers. And we try to be the intersection, if you will, of consumers and producers. And so we fill that role. So lots going on. And we'll make sure that we're talking about getting back to Geneva, Switzerland for our global grain meeting in May. But the world of agriculture is going to be dynamic and ever interesting for years to come.
Well, I know you're a busy man, so thank you for making the time to chat. I'll see you at the latest in March for another dairy producers event in general. And if we can help at all with the Farm Foundation stuff, whether it's, plugging on the podcast or anything else we can do, I hope you'll let us know.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you for all you do. And I find geopolitics and agriculture, that intersection, so important. And I know we'll light up on it again. Thank you, Jacob.
I think unfortunately it's not going anywhere.
It's not going away. It is not going away.
All right. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidents podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.